a graphic that I'd like to share with you in terms of coping zones and how that's so important to adaptation and to climate change, and also to managing risks and identifying vulnerability. So let's say this is the lake levels in a lake in this particular region. And the lake levels have historically fluctuated within a particular range. There are some times where it's gone high and there have been some impacts, and then other cases where it's gone very low and there have been impacts. Under a changing climate, the frequency of higher and lower water levels may increase, or they may become more severe. And so over time, communities, activities, people have become accustomed to a range of water levels, let's say. That's their coping zone. If that starts to be more variable and go outside their coping zones, then they're going to experience more damages or impacts. And so that's when you have to think about what needs to be done. With practice climates, you can explore those coping zones, when they might be affected, how frequently they might be affected, at least to anticipate some of the issues so that you can have an early dialogue and get more information to inform this process. So with adaptation, hopefully you expand your coping zone. But just a caveat, sometimes the changes are so rapid or so significant that adaptation cannot maintain a system as it currently is or under current expectations as well. So one of the unique things for this project was that stakeholders, so interests that are defined under the Boundary Waters Treaty as well as the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, so recreational boating, shoreline, municipal water supply, navigation, shoreline managers, etc. Identified, they have various technical working groups, and we challenge them to come up with thresholds and ranges, coping ranges. So coping zone A, that's the preferred or the acceptable zone. That's, you know, what we expect and what we like and what we can sort of adapt or respond to, right, without incurring huge environmental damages or huge economic costs. Zone B, you know, it's a little difficult, you know, it's challenging, it may cost me more to operate, but I can cope under the current management strategies that I have in place right now. C is the zone where management have to be adapted to avoid serious negative consequences. So you have to really invest in thinking about what changes might be needed and how to implement them. These A, B, and C zones and the thresholds sort of help to identify when water regulation rules might need to be changed, for example, on Lake Superior. One of the challenges, though, is trend detection and determining whether you are in a changed situation or whether it's just a short little period. So that's one of the key challenges. That's why adaptability and resilience is important as part of the management strategy. And this focus helped, this sort of A, B, and C coping zones help to identify regulation plans or future conditions where there might be significant vulnerabilities at places or in activities. This is just a summary to give you a little bit of a sense of what some of the coping zones were, how we attributed or went through the discussion for the ecosystem coping zone. That was really, really hard. It was much easier to come up with coping zones, let's say, for navigation and hydropower than it was for complex, poorly understood, wetland complexes or fisheries habitat. I mean, it was a real challenge. But part of the discussion was Zone A is, you know, wetlands need perturbations and water level changes, so we expect those, but what is a good coping range? If the changes are so significant, are we seeing unbeneficial changes to the wetland, for example? And Zone C is water levels could go up so high that you completely wipe out a wetland if it has nowhere to migrate because of infrastructure, road, or whatever. So those are the different levels of coping zones that we tried to identify and attach a water level height, duration, or frequency to. And here's just it's a conceptual example of how one might have high water coping zone C, low water coping zone C, coping zone B, and then the zone A, given the variability, but it's still within a manageable range. So that's stakeholder-led, that's bottom-up. People identifying and actually really working through what their expectations are. It also challenges and identifies where you don't have information and where you need to get more. So then once we had the coping zones and the stakeholders identified those, then we ran hundreds of climate scenarios to come up with different water level supply conditions, and then an accounting of how frequently we had zone A, B, and C conditions at, let's say, Long Point, which was my study site on Lake Erie. So getting an understanding of, under these different scenarios, how many times would we go into coping zone, zone C? From that, you can get a sense of, you talk about the frequency or plausibility of that risk, or those A, B, or C zones happening in the supply sequence of the lake levels, for example. And also, the plausibility means that in these practice climates, we've actually have some evidence that these conditions might occur. Some of them might occur once in 1,000 years series. Some might happen 100 times, so you can get an accounting of that. And you can provide quantitative information on some of the coping zone impacts. And then there's a sort of an assessment that happens. So you look at the impacts along one side and the plausibility, based on the combination of the stakeholder identified coping zones and those many, many practice climates and water levels and flows that we derive. And you ask yourself, zone A is anticipated sort of impacts or costs, and if you look at your supply sequences or your practice climates, if you don't see any indication the scenario will occur, it's not really of much concern. However, if it's a zone C and it's got irreversible damages and it's common, unusual but expected in your series, then you pay attention to that potential vulnerability and you start to think about how one might respond to that. So this kind of framing of the risk or binning of that kind of information to these plausibility groupings as well as impact groupings gives people a sense of where they might need to pay attention. Doesn't mean that some of these mightn't occur, but certainly the ones where you're least prepared for or there's most concern about, those ones at least deserve immediate attention, and the other ones attention at a later date, for example. We all have limited resources and time, and here's a way of sort of addressing that issue. So in concluding, and thank you so much for your attention, I just wanted to leave you with some sort of comments. I guess. I've been doing climate change for a long time. I've watched the issue evolve from in the late 80s, where we were trying to define the problem, in the early 1990s in the Great Lakes Project, where we actually talked adaptation, to now the rubber is really starting to hit the ground, where we have more and more communities asking, how do I assess impacts and how do I learn to adapt? Assessing impacts and adapting is not going to be an easy task. It needs to be, one needs to build capacity in many, many areas. Often we've talked about the uncertainty of climate change means that I don't have to act. It's just too uncertain. I hope I've given you some kind of ideas based on research that I've been involved with on ways to sort of tackle the problem so that you can start to make informed decisions for your watershed. One of the first things I think that people need to have their antennae up about are asking the questions, are we detecting changes in climate? What's occurring in my region? So is the temperature getting warmer? Are we seeing more flooding events in the spring? So use your local knowledge to sort of get an understanding about how things might be changing. But also asking for help from the scientists to help you with that attribution challenge. Another thing that one can start thinking about right away is understanding the sensitivities to climate. Because often many people thought climate was normal, it didn't change, it was just in the background. We knew that we could count on certain climatic conditions in July and in winter, or certain temperatures, etc. But those will be changing. So understand how activities, plants, animals might be, resources might be sensitive to climate. Scenarios are a good way of exploring challenges, opportunities, vulnerabilities, and sensitivities. And it also gives one, if you run enough scenarios, one can get a sense of how robust or how resilient something has to be. What that really means is what range of conditions might we expect in the future and might we need to respond to or adapt to. I think there's enough science and enough people around the world, and the IPCC document is a really good place to start. It's pretty scientific language, but there's still some nuggets of real good information there to understand what other people are starting to do adaptation activities. And also try and seek out the best science that's available. Think about flexibility and larger margins of error, because it gives you that sense of that opportunity to be resilient. What you don't want to do is plan or commit yourself with no way out. You always want to think about and anticipate ways of planning and giving yourself resilience so that you aren't vulnerable. In monitoring of conditions and also adaptive management, the adaptive management approach for sure encourages a learning by doing, and learning and implementing activities that one monitors to see if they're successful, and changes or redirects based on information as time passes or needs change in time. So I hope I've helped you with a little bit of insight into the adaptation research field, and I'd be more than happy to answer questions if there's time for that.
Definitely.